I'm going to do it again. So, welcome to Holding Space with Claire Bidwell Smith and Allison Gilbert. My name is Dara Cosberg, and I am the program director at Reimagine. And we are a nonprofit organization that sparks community experiences like this one to empower individuals, families, and communities to really face the hardest parts of our existence, including illness and death, but also celebrate life and one another. We just wrapped up our, spring and summer festival, Life, Loss, and Love. And we're right now kind of in between festivals, and we will be launching a new festival in October called Creating Space. In exciting news, Holding Space will continue on. So this is going to be the end of our season one, which is amazing. And, you all here that have attended have really made these such wonderful experiences. With that, I'm just going to make sure that you all know how to use Zoom, which I'm sure at this point you do, but we're going to keep the mics off. We will be doing a Q&A where you will be able to, if you want to raise your hand, or most people just ask questions in the comments. And we do recommend keeping your cameras on, as it does make us feel more connected, but not required. And if you're finding the chat to being distracting, you can, I don't know what's happening in my mouse, you can click in the top right corner and exit out. And with that, I'm going to introduce Claire. She is an internationally renowned author, speaker, and grief expert. She's the author of 3 books of nonfiction: The Rules of Inheritance, After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? And Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. With that, thank you, Claire.
Sarah. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. For anyone who's new this week, this is our final week of the season, and I just started this series like off the cuff when the pandemic happened. I wanted to create space for all of us to come together and kind of be together in community and talk about everything that we were feeling and everything that was coming up. I've been working in the field of grief and loss for over a decade, and I know that when big things happen like this, it can often activate a lot of old grief or anxiety for so many of us who've been through big loss. And also for those of us who haven't, we're facing more existential questions than maybe ever in our lifetimes and trying to juggle so much. So I wanted to come on every week, bring all these amazing people I know in the death and dying and grief space to talk with you guys and give you the chance to talk with them. So I'm really excited today to have my friend Allison Gilbert here. Allison Gilbert is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and one of the most thought-provoking and influential writers on grief and resilience. The author of numerous books, including the groundbreaking Past and Present: Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive. Her stirring work exposes the secret and essential factor for harnessing loss to drive happiness and rebound from adversity. She serves on the board of directors for the National Alliance for Grieving Children and the advisory board for the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, the preeminent national organization providing grief support to families of America's fallen heroes. Welcome, Allison.
Hey, Claire. I'm so glad to be here. It's so good to see you. It's been way too long.
I know. The last time I saw you was in Washington, D.C. at the launch of the TAPS program. And we were there with Jon Stewart, which was probably one of the biggest celebrity situations I've ever been in. It
was incredible. I'm still pinching myself.
Yeah, getting a hug from Jon Stewart and sharing a stage with him was something else. But you really helped with the launch of that program, and it's an amazing one. But anyway, you and I met, it was over 10 years ago. I was thinking about this the other morning. We met in Chicago, and I was a new mom, and my first book hadn't even come out yet. And You were giving a talk at Gilda's Club.
I was supposed to be giving a talk. If you remember, I think that no one came. I think it was like the most mortifying author nightmare that anyone could ever have. So yeah, I was booked to give a talk, and then I think it was you and me in a whole entire room, and I think that's how we actually got to know each other.
But that was kind of awesome, right? Now it's been all these years of
Well,
crossing
it
paths.
certainly cracked open a moment for us to get to know each other. That is for sure. And like we all know on this call, good things can often happen from really mortifying situations. So I count you as that blessing from that awful day.
Definitely. But I remember being really struck by hearing your story that day. And I would love for you to start today by sharing your personal story with our guests.
Well, you and I actually have so much in common, not only with our work professionally, with our personal stories. My mother passed away from ovarian cancer right after I graduated college. It felt very soon after I graduated college. I was 25, right when I was kind of launching my career. And my father passed away a few years after that. And I know we're going to be talking about 9/11, but it feels very, timely to talk about it. My father died that Friday. So 9/11 was on Tuesday. So my second parent passed away that Tuesday. I'm sorry, that week on that Friday. And so between covering the events that day for a news station, because I was still a reporter and a journalist and a producer at that time, and my father dying that Friday, it propelled me into wanting to write about and discuss and really dig into this work about what it means to grieve, what does bereavement look like over time, and how do we, push forward, and how do we build resilience? And that's been the real focus of my work lately. So I'm so happy to be here.
I love that. You and I really strive to kind of get this message across that we don't need to get over the loss of our loved ones. In fact, we need to really stay connected with them and find ways to do that and find ways to create.
Getting over just sounds ridiculous. How do you get over losing your mom and your dad or any other loved one who you care for? I like to use the word A-N-D is like my favorite word. You can mourn and you can be sad and you can be angry and you can be resentful and you can kind of, bash your fists against the pillow, and you can also embrace life of what you have now, and you can be really feeling gratitude for if you have great family, if you have great friends, if you really love your job. That doesn't discount the loss. It just means that there's room for both.
Yeah, I know. I think sometimes people think that they have to only be sad or only feel anger or guilt or just kind of some of these harder emotions. And, I know that it's really common in the first months, year to kind of, you catch yourself laughing and you feel that sudden, like, you stop yourself.
You feel guilty.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, reminding people that you can be both of those things at the same time, and you can always miss your person and want them back and still live a meaningful life and a beautiful life.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
you went from being a journalist to losing both of your parents, and then how did you kind of enter into the grief world? And tell us about your first book and your most, all your books.
Yeah, I don't think I would actually say I don't think I've left the journalism field altogether. I just think I've applied them differently. So I still feel a great sense of a rush when I report a story and I do fact finding and I go out and talk to people and I write a good piece. And I'm just choosing now to have the focus of those pieces be about what we're talking about right now. So I still feel I'm a different kind of journalist. I'm no longer in those newsrooms that I grew up with. And I saw that Joanne is here on the call, and I haven't seen Joanne in person in I think like 20 years. But we grew up in the newsroom business together, and it's so great to see you here. And so I feel like what became more important to me over time was writing and reporting and researching stories that I was personally struggling with, and to hopefully amplify not just my story, but how we are collectively coping and managing and finding strength. And so that's how I found myself here. I found myself kind of bridging two worlds, like my personal world of personal loss, and then my professional world of being a real hardcore producer for like 20 years in the TV business, whether it was CNN or MSNBC or any of the local New York TV stations, and really trying to use those skills for what you and I are now talking about, which is this incredibly important, really a field that I think is getting more and more deserving attention, especially now in light of COVID-19 and there being so much loss, not just in this country, but of course around the world.
I know it's been such an interesting time, especially for those of us who are in this field, to kind of see such a new awareness of grief come about in the world.
Yeah, for sure. I 100% agree. And, tomorrow is the 19th anniversary of 9/11, and I was nearly killed that day by falling debris and smoke inhalation. I was in the hospital with tubes down my throat. And when the tubes were taken out, reporting live from my hospital bed for WNBC TV that day. And so grief and trauma and anxiety and being completely overwhelmed by a loss in connection to kind of that experience, kind of giving rise to all those feelings of having lost my mom 5 years before and then losing my father. I feel like this is the conversation that maybe I was, meant to have to not only make me feel stronger and better, but hopefully kind of lending a digital hug, to everyone here on this, call today, because I feel like in many ways, all of our stories are, of course, different. We are all individuals, and I feel like there are differences, but there's really some incredible commonality that I know Claire. I mean, look at all the books you've written about grief and loss and moving forward. And so you have such an incredible point of view from your perspective that is, it's just so urgent to share at this time.
It is. What do you know now about grief that you didn't initially, when you first lost your mom and you're kind of in that brand new space of grief? I think sometimes we've gone through other losses, but then we have a loss like your mother and you suddenly find yourself in that really intense grief. What do you know now about that time or about that experience?
Well, you know what? It's funny. It's a really good question. And I would say the reason why I wrote my last book, Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive, is really the answer to your question. It's like, what did I learn over time? What I learned over time for me was this. When loss was fresh and new and my parents had just died, I received, thankfully, I'm one of the lucky ones, support from well-meaning friends and family, and people really knew in general how to show up for me. And that allowed me, without my knowing, to be passive when it came to my grief and my moving forward. It allowed me just to kind of sit back and absorb the well wishes. And again, I was lucky because not everyone does feel like they get support from their friends and family when a loved one dies. But here's what got me upset over time or resentful over time or angry is that at the 1-year anniversary or at the 5-year anniversary or 10-year anniversary, those same people, not because they were mean-spirited, they didn't show up anymore. And so for me, what that pivot was and how it relates to that book I just mentioned, Past and Present, is that it was up to me to be proactive. I was no longer able to be reactive or passive. I had to proactively keep my parents' memory alive. And I didn't have the tools to do that. Yes, of course, you can go to a cemetery. And yes, of course, you can light a candle. But I wanted actual ideas, creative opportunities, to talk about my parents, to keep their memory alive, to share stories. And that's why that book contains 85 ideas for remembering and, keeping those traditions going that they started. Because of course I had children after they died. My parents didn't get to know. My daughter never met her grandparents. And my son was only 18 months old when my father died, the second parent to die. So I needed to also create ways for my children to know their grandparents. And so to me, that's the lesson, Claire. That's the lesson for me that I didn't know. I didn't know that I had to have agency. I had to have responsibility for how I moved forward in my grieving process. And for me, there was incredible healing when I pivoted to actively remembering my parents.
That's such an interesting way to look at it and to talk about it. Just that passivity and the reactionary way that you dealt with it. In my experience, when I was 18, when my mom died, people showed up, that kind of like the week of the funeral, the memorial, and then there really wasn't much else. And I continually got this message from the people around me, my culture and my family, to move on. Just like I was 18, I was setting off into the world, going to college, just, get over it, move on. And so when I was experiencing so much grief and angst and anxiety and sadness over the years after that, I really thought there was something wrong with me. I thought that I was doing this wrong. I really thought there was something wrong with me because everyone around me expected me to be fine and to move on. And so it took me a long time to, one, realize that there was nothing wrong with me. I was grieving the loss of my mother. And then two, the thing that also healed me so much was finding ways to connect with her and my father, who had also died, and to really bring them into my life, to find ways to honor them, to have these kind of internal or spiritual relationships with them. And that took me a decade or more, and at that point, I kind of had to almost reconnect with them because I had tried so hard to get over it, as everyone suggested.
Yeah, yeah. And listen, and you have young kids. And so there are these wonderfully open vessels for stories about your parents. And so that's a gift.
It is. I love talking to my kids about my parents, and I do it all the time. And it's definitely a way of kind of just keeping them in our lives, which is so important.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of one of the big questions I've received from people during this pandemic is it okay to feel grief when it's not the loss of a person? And, of course, yes. But what's interesting to me is that people don't feel that permission to do that. Again, that goes back to kind of our culture, but we are all grieving so much. And I'm thinking about 9/11 too, and just this kind of public grief for people we never met, grief for national tragedies or world tragedies, grief for notable figures who die that we didn't know. There's so much grief there. And what do you have to say about that? I know you have so many.
Yeah, well, for sure. There's something that I've been really interested in lately, and I just saw it being published, and I'm looking at my notes so I don't get it wrong. In Trauma Psychology, which is a publication of the American Psychological Association, they just published a study, literally within the last few months, about what they call uncertainty distress. And I really relate to this. This is about, the ground feels, uneven beneath your feet. The world feels like it's spinning on a very odd and unfamiliar axis. And how do you recalibrate? And I feel like uncertainty distress could be one more layer that we now have the vocabulary to add to the conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So we have grief, we have loss, we have fear in many cases about what is happening, what's the unknown. But uncertainty distress really is this umbrella term that I think will allow us to have a new discussion that's really, really pinned on science about kind of the ripple effects of COVID-19, right? It's not just what you said, it's not a loss like a person, but what is the collective loss that we are all grieving? And I think that's very real.
Absolutely. Are there ways you recommend people kind of tap into that kind of grief? When we're grieving 9/11 or marking this anniversary, or we're grieving for just seeing the numbers on the news every night of how many people are dying. Do you have recommendations for kind of how to let ourselves feel that grief?
Yeah, well, I would say two things. One, turn off the news. And I'm talking about being a news person, like a news junkie. Like, there's only so many headlines that you really need to absorb. And maybe your diet doesn't have to be every hour or, every even day. You're going to get the gist of things well enough for maybe one source of news. Maybe it's not all media. Maybe you can kind of keep yourself into some sort of regimented, like how much can you really take on? Because of course, as you know, there's studies that your anxiety, ramps up when you're kind of bombarded by different headlines. But I would say this too. I just read that in England, this is actually very, very interesting. They're actually putting together what they're calling bereavement bubbles. If you're a parent these days, talking about, schooling and getting your kids into educational pods, this is a very similar tactic that they're now describing as being bereavement bubbles. And how can you make sure that you are finding those like-minded people in the sense of they want to discuss these topics, they want to be open about them, they want to crack open, honest, transparent dialogue. How can you find camaraderie in that? And we know, and I know you know this, that the more we share and the more we put ourselves in the company of other people who get it and who want to listen, not even your own sibling may be in the same place as you, but yet a stranger who may live 3,000 miles away may feel more appropriate at this juncture to share. I like just briefly to talk about my brother. I adore him. He's my older brother. And yet we couldn't be more different when it comes to having lost the same parents. It's not that he loved them any less, but he doesn't have the same need to maybe talk about them as readily or share stories about them as openly. I built an entire e-course about keeping memories of our loved ones alive through photographs, right? Through scrapbooks, through, objects and heirlooms. And there's no way my brother would take those courses. You can find your camaraderie in whatever bereavement bubble, that you choose. And this can be your family of choice when it comes to grief. I hope I've just made sense, but I think you can choose the community that makes you feel whole and makes you feel more in control. And that's one other thing I would say before we move on, which is that part of uncertainty distress is because so much of loss and death and grief and COVID-19 and September 11th, that's all out of our control, right? Everything is out of our control. And so for me, when you went back to that first question, or one of the first questions is, what have I learned? Keeping the memory of your loved one alive, now that is 100% in my control. So that's the antidote for me to much of the anxiety or the uncertainty distress. What can you control? I can control turning off the news and only digesting it when I want to. And I could certainly control how I celebrate the memory of my parents, and not just for myself, but for my kids as well.
Absolutely. That's amazing. That's such a good way to look at it too. I like these takes you have on things. I knew you were going to have a bunch of good insights for us, Allison. One of the things that I feel is often true of grieving is that it feels very lonely and very isolating, and you can sometimes feel like you're the only person in the world going through it. Everyone's kind of going about their days and their lives, and your world has kind of been shattered. Right now, it's a little interesting because so many of us are actually going through it at the same time. However, on the flip side, we're isolated in our homes, so we can't be together. We can't have funerals and memorials and sit shiva and give each other hugs and bring casseroles over. So it's this, this really strange time in which to be grieving. I went to my first Zoom memorial this week, and it was for a friend of mine whose mom died of COVID last week, and she was only 63 years old, and she got it from her mother, who also died. So he lost his grandmother and his mom last week, and just really devastating. And it was my first Zoom memorial that I had been to, and I've been to one Zoom wedding, during COVID and one Zoom memorial now. But I'm thinking, what are things we can do? I bet you have some great ideas for if anyone here knows somebody who's just recently going through grief and during COVID, what can we do to support them?
Well, you and I together are a part of the Global COVID-19 Relief Coalition, and the folks who really chaperoned that to its, wonderful conclusion, if you will, this wonderful report. That white paper is available to anyone who wants it, and so that has a wonderful list of resources that maybe we can put in the chat too. It's a COVID white paper, and it's a wonderful resource that can really get folks to where they need to be. I hope you guys can see me because my screen just went completely white. Can you guys still hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, you can hear you.
My whole screen just changed color and I don't see anything anymore. But if you guys can still hear me, I'll keep going.
Yep.
So that would be one place to go that has a wonderful list of resources. In terms of putting together an actual virtual memorial that can honor your loved one in as big and bold and rich way as you would have loved to have done if they had passed away without COVID-19, like an in-person virtual memorial, there are definitely ways to do that. And that is the biggest question. Those are the most pressing questions that so many people have right now. So that was the first e-course I made, right? How to design, create, and organize the most meaningful virtual memorial right now. The one piece of advice right off the top that I could give, if you don't mind, can I say? Okay. Well, I think a Zoom memorial, if you're doing it on Zoom, can be great when it's big, because then you're being inclusive, right? You're inviting everyone to join and being a part. If you can make it more intimate and allow for one-on-one time, even though there's physical distance involved, that will make it more personal. And then you'll get to talk to your friends and family who you can't see in person, but you can still talk to them one-on-one. So how can you do that? And I just want to give you one tip, and I really believe this is really important. If you, let's say, develop a Google Sheet, or maybe it's an Excel spreadsheet, or maybe you give this job to a well-meaning friend who wants to help you because you have more to deal with right now about losing your loved one. You don't want to deal with the technology of those kind of forms. And you allow your friends and family and coworkers and neighbors to sign up for timed slots where you can then introduce them and talk with them and have each person have their own time with you. That will enable you to have that one-on-one time that we all crave right now. Of course, I go into more detail in the course, but that's really the kind of the top line, which is how to get a Zoom memorial that's big, to feel more intimate and to get some of that real touch points that we're all missing right now because of COVID-19.
I love that. Can you believe that we had to start thinking about doing this, like these virtual memorials? I don't think we could have ever imagined that we would be in this place doing these things.
I know.
It blows my mind.
Yeah, it blows my mind too. And yet, if there's anything that I have now seen and I'm not surprised by, but of course it's like shocking, the ingenuity of human beings to get around things that seem insurmountable is impressive to me. Just the fact that people who are tech shy can now be joining us from as far away, I think we saw as Ireland, and come together in a safe space that Claire and Reimagine that you are providing just goes to show that we are nimble. And who could have imagined us doing this, in February?
No, it's really true. So what are you working on right now, Allison? You've got all these amazing courses going on. Are you working on another book?
Yeah, I am. It's really exciting. So it's actually related to the death of my mom-ish. Um, so here, I got to come up with my elevator, my one-liner about what this is about, but let me, hold on just for a second. So after my mom died, my brother and I were cleaning out our childhood home. And in that process, I found a folded up piece of paper in one of my mother's books. And that led me on this discovery of a lifetime. And I'll spare you the details, but it's a biography. I'm writing my first biography. So it's a very, very different process. And I'm using all those journalism skills that we had talked about before to explore this incredible woman's life who I came across only because my mother died. And so it's like a gift my mother had left me, which is like these little, breadcrumbs to explore this woman's life. She's a pioneer. She was just a sassy, brazen, incredible woman. And I get to spend time with her in my imagination, of course, because it's a biography. And she died in the 1950s and she was born in the late 1800s. And I am just having an incredible time.
That's amazing.
Deer in the headlights. I've never written a book like this, but I'm really, I feel really close to my mom as I'm writing it. So in that way, it's still about my experiences having lost my mom, but she's really led me in a direction that is giving me incredible joy.
That's incredible. I love that.
Yeah.
Here's something I want to ask you about. Is one of the things that this was actually my New Year's resolution to like work on this more and tidy it up. And then COVID happened and it became even more important for me to do this. But I spent some time, and I finished it this summer, getting everything in order if something were to happen to me right now, so something, obviously I will die at some point, but if I have an early death, like if I get COVID and I'm gone next week, whatever, anything that happens, what do I have in place? Do I have everything put together? And I did everything from really basic stuff to, what are my internet passwords and my different bank accounts, to much bigger things, letters to my kids and where I want certain, jewelry and paintings and things, who they go to and what matters. Is this something you've done? And what do you have to recommend for people who are thinking about doing this, or why it's important?
Yeah, it sounds like you've done a lot more than I have in terms of like individual possessions and maybe telling the stories behind them. And that's a really, really good idea. What I have done, and this was even before my children were in elementary school, like when they were really young, of course we had all the official documentation drawn up by, we did it with attorneys, power of attorneys and healthcare proxies and, wills and, all those, documents that you really need. And in those documents, of course, we have all of the critical information that you were just describing in terms of assets and bank accounts. And so we do have those. I am in an interesting spot right now. Both of my kids are 18 or older. And so we also had information in these documents that is no longer necessary, which is about, who will take care of them if my husband or I died, young. And so that's an odd thing to think about too, because now they're either 18 or older.
Yeah.
My daughter just started college. And so there's a progression, but I feel like my husband really knows what are those objects and heirlooms that I so dearly want to pass along. He knows, of course, the stories behind them. But you're right. Those stories, if he and I were to, die together, that would be a problem. So maybe you're inspiring me, Claire, that maybe some of these stories I need to write down just in case it's the two of us.
I think it's important stuff to do. One of the reasons I do this and work on it too is to alleviate anxiety, because I have a lot of anxiety I don't have anxiety about being dead or the physicality of dying. I have anxiety about leaving my kids. That's where all my anxiety lies. And so doing this kind of preparation work makes me feel better that things are in place. I sent a copy of this document that I had put everything into to one of my best friends, also to my husband. So it's in multiple places, like everything is spelled out. And that really helps me calm down a little bit and gives them something after I'm gone. We had Amy Pickard on a few episodes ago to talk about, she has a company called Good to Go where she helps people work on these things. And she used to have in-person family gatherings and everyone would work on it. But it's kind of amazing how many people don't even know what their spouse, how they would like to be buried or cremated, or don't know people's wishes, you know, because we're afraid to talk about it.
Well, it's interesting what you said, by the way, just to go back to the fact that you kind of calmed your anxiety in this way that you're describing. And I must just point out to everyone who's listening to you, which is that you got control from something that felt out of control. And because you wrestled with those documents and because you made it a priority and because you took control and you were proactive, that's really exactly what I was saying before. Again, that sense of agency, it sounds like from what you're describing, calms your anxiety. And for me, that same sense of agency calmed myself of being, upset if other people weren't remembering my parents the way I wanted them to. And it allowed me to flip from being upset or sad that people weren't remembering my parents as much as I was, or at least vocalizing that, to them being okay because I had these tools and I was going to do it on my own and in community with my family, and I was going to be the one who was going to be proactive. And so I think you're right on it. I think this proactivity piece, it's like finding a new job, right? Finding a new doctor. There's a sense of like, it's up to you. I think that goes to, in some ways, what we're talking about here in terms of grief and anxiety.
Yeah, and I just think COVID has illuminated this a lot more for all of us, that we need to be having these conversations. We need to be thinking about these things. We need to be putting things in place. There's a couple of things in the chat bar here. Why Woods Harris says, I'm getting all this information to do a virtual memorial for my husband on the anniversary of his death, November 21st, 2020. And I like the idea of getting people to RSVP and give them time. That's lovely. Do you have anything you want to add for this?
Well, you know what? I'm a big believer in being a delegator. And that not only takes things off your shoulders because you're already dealing with the loss of your husband, but it allows other people who want to help, who don't know how to help, to give them a task that actually can be useful to you. I think a lot of times we hear people say, and they truly mean it, what can I do? Just let me know. And that, of course, puts the burden on the person who's grieving to come up with a job. And instead, this is very specific. And if you want someone to help you in that specific way, I think a friend or a family member or even a neighbor or a work, a colleague will feel a great sense of relief that they're doing something for you and you actually want it to be that way. And, if you do, by the way, if you're on this call and you do want to take any of the courses, but the virtual memorials course, if you want, I'll make up a code, let's say it's Claire. I'll call it Claire and you can get a discount off, off the courses. And that'd be really my pleasure. So email me after this and I'll come up with a code. And I would love you to take the class because I think there's a lot of ways that we can make virtual memorials really, really meaningful. One way I'll say too, if I can just go off on a little bit of a tangent about virtual memorials, I come from a TV news background and there's something great about Zooms, right? We're all here and we're all talking, but it's also the perfect platform, as we know, even and really more so during a virtual memorial, to use videos. Why don't we play a video during a virtual memorial? And one idea for incorporating videos during a virtual memorial is having people who you can't be with record a 1-minute eulogy, a 2-minute eulogy. Now, of course, they can, of course, do it just on the screen and they can read their speech and their eyes can look down and they won't be able to look at you while they're doing that. I think what a video allows you to do is enable more people to say what they want to say in a short period of time. Excuse me, I get so choked up about it. Like if you give that honor to, 15 people and you give them each, maybe a couple seconds or a few minutes each, and you dole that opportunity out, I think the Zoom memorial is going to be more memorable. And that really suits the goal, right? Is honoring your loved one. So I wouldn't overlook these other opportunities to make these memorials more inviting and more memorable and really more meaningful.
I think that's a great suggestion. I'm just thinking about this memorial I went to this week, and there seemed to be a fair amount of family members who just couldn't figure out the technicalities of the Zoom. And there was a lot of interruptions, a lot of things, which are fine, but it was such an emotional experience that then, having to take a minute where you're sitting for 2 minutes, kind of waiting for things to happen, it interrupted the flow a lot. And you're right, having these videos prepared ahead of time, I think is such a great idea. They had a beautiful slideshow, which was really lovely and so emotional that, and that is one of the cool things that Zoom allows.
Yeah.
Joanne has a really good question here. She says, for Allison, my dad passed away 2 years ago now, and it took me a year to step back into my childhood home to start learning it out, start cleaning it out, as I had PTSD from long-term caregiving. What tips do you have for letting go of things? You can't keep everything, and they're only things. Our memories are in our hearts and minds. Would love your perspective.
I totally understand where you're coming from, first of all. It feels very heavy to let go of the possessions that our loved ones used, that they touched. Maybe if these possessions, some of them could even keep their smell, right? I mean, depending on what you have, if it's clothing or a scarf, right? These can retain perfume or cologne. So I get it, Joanne. Here's what I would say, and there's a lot to say. And so please, let's talk offline, and certainly take my course, Objects and Heirlooms. That's just number one, too. But here's a thought. Give yourself permission, if you can, to divide things in. These aren't the only piles, but these could be some of the piles, and a pile can be literal or figurative. But one is I just don't know what to do with this. I may want this later pile. Like it means something to you. So you're feeling this pull. This is really where a lot of our belongings end up going, right? I like it. I don't love it, but I feel guilty about giving it away. Put all of those things into one box or two or three or however many you need, and give yourself the permission, Joanne, to deal with those objects later. Once you give them away, once you sell them, once you donate them, there is no going back. You can't get them back. And so if you are torn about certain objects and heirlooms, give yourself a pause. Now, that's not doable if the home is going to be sold. And that's why I say, pack it up, bring it to your home or your apartment, or put it in storage, but buy yourself some time. That's for the more difficult belongings. The easier ones are things that you know that you're not going to want, but someone somewhere would have value, would find them of value. And I'll just share one quick story. There's a lot more to talk about in regard to objects and heirlooms, but I'll just share this. After my mother died, I could not keep everything. I lived in an apartment in New York City. I could not handle the volume of her belongings at that time. I was only 25. And so what we did was we meaningfully gave some of her possessions away. And what I mean by that is the immediate family has the abundance problem. There's so much that you can keep, and there's so much that you can give away. But think about, Joanne, all the people who are in your family who loved your dad, who want a piece of your dad for themselves. Maybe they were his coworkers. Maybe they were his students. If he was a teacher, I'm kind of making this up. Maybe they are neighbors. Maybe you can go back in time and find one of his professors. You get my point. Expand the circle of the people who knew your dad. Maybe they were his nurses towards the end of his life. Maybe they were his doctors. Maybe they were the hospice workers. I'm obviously making some of this up, but an object that you no longer have use for would be of incredible meaning to those people who knew your dad and who have no physical tether to him. So think about giving away objects in a meaningful way. That sometimes is easier than maybe donating them to Goodwill.
Mm-hmm. Those are amazing suggestions. Thank you, Allison.
Yeah.
I also always recommend ask a friend or two to come help you. It's just the work itself is hard, but it's emotional, it's just tiring and exhausting every year. Even just moving moving without the loss of a loved one, or the holidays, you guys, I've started asking friends to come over and help me dismantle my Christmas tree. Cause I'm like, come over and help me take the ornaments down. And then we'll go to your house and do the same thing. Cause I just can't handle doing it by myself anymore.
Yeah.
It's too much and it's depressing.
Yeah.
So invite a friend over to help you. Viv has a question. How do you manage / work through mentally if those you've asked to contribute to a 5-year anniversary memorial do not respond? It's disappointing.
Yeah, it really is disappointing. And I would go back to my brother. He and I think about these topics very differently. And I would say make the event for you. And those people who come and show up and who want to also participate will be the ones who should be there. And if those people who are not responding came, they likely wouldn't be the kind of participants in the event that you're planning that you would want anyway. So I think that's a self-selection that may actually save you some heartache in the future. Because if they came and weren't engaged, if they came and were dragging their feet, if they came and were maybe even disparaging to what you were trying to pull off, that could be really, really hurtful, especially on the day that your event is taking place. There's one activity that I could really recommend to amplify what it sounds like you're already creating, which is, I don't know if you've heard me talk about the memory bash, these memory parties, but on my website, you're more than welcome to go there. I have some really great information about planning and organizing these incredible memory parties where everyone comes together to eat and drink and have a great time. But the reason for coming together is to celebrate our loved ones, keep their memory alive in a way that feels good and warm and fun. And so those people who will come to a memory bash will also be self-selecting. And then you'll be left with the people who are sharing your mindset of wanting to do this kind of work, which can be work and it can be hard, but can also be so rewarding and so fun. So I really hope you continue to do that and embrace those who are joining you on the journey, and try to not worry yourself too much on those who are not coming along. Focus on the ones who are.
I love that. That's incredible. If you guys have any more questions for Allison, we have a few minutes left, so put them in. She has so many amazing suggestions. Can you give us a couple of highlights you have so many goodies in past and present of different ways we can kind of use these heirlooms or memories together. Can you give us a couple of goodies from that?
Well, I'm going to flip the switch, Claire, because if I remember correctly, you've done some incredible things to remember your parents. And I remember being floored by your creativity. What are some of the things that you have done to honor your mom and your dad?
I do something almost every year on their death anniversaries. And my mom is, her death has always been just a really painful one for me. And so it's important to me each year to kind of mark that day and get through it, either in a celebration or just to get through it. And now I really bring my daughters into it. I almost always cook because she was a cook. And so I'll make something that she used to make. Every year on her birthdays, my daughters make her a birthday cake, which is really fun. And we sing to her, and they, they're getting older now, but when we started doing this, they were really young, and they would make these like crazy cakes, just covered in all kinds of stuff. And it was just fun. Now they're making more edible, beautiful cakes.
I love that. I love that.
So we do that. On my dad's 10-year death anniversary, I took a flight lesson. My dad had been a pilot in World War II. And I thought it would just be a really cool way to kind of commune with him, do this thing that he had always done. So I took like a small plane flight lesson out of Santa Monica Airport. And it was amazing. I think it made me feel closer to him than anything I'd done in a decade since he'd been gone. So that was really a neat thing to do.
That's incredible. I've never heard you talk about that. I love it.
It was really amazing. So yeah, I put up pictures of them all the time. I try to find new things. So yeah, Joanne wants to know if either of us have ever used a medium to connect to parents.
Well, that's all about you. Joanne, you've asked the right person, because Claire has written an entire book about using mediums and psychics. And well, Claire, after this was like one of the most incredible books I've ever read. So you should answer this question.
Yes, I have seen probably a couple dozen psychic mediums. They have not all been good. Some of them have been great. Some of them so-so. I think it's a really interesting way to open up the sense of connection. It's not the only way, but it's definitely a really interesting way. So I recommend kind of checking it out, but not going into it feeling like it's going to be the be all end all of things, but also not being scared of it. It's perfectly normal for us to really yearn for that sense of connection or yearn for some kind of answer or resolution. It's normal to want those things. So yeah.
Joanne, definitely pick up Claire's book after this. It's called After This. It's blue, if I remember correctly, on the cover, and I think you'll find it really fascinating.
Thank you so much for being here with us today, Allison. Just tell us one more time, like where we can find you, and if people want to message you or take your courses or follow you on Instagram, what are all?
Thank you. I'm an open book. You can get in touch with me everywhere. So my website is Allison Gilbert. You can find the courses on my website, which I would love you guys to take. There's, we talked about the one about virtual memorials that has been of this moment. I could not have even thought to create that class if not for COVID-19. Obviously, there's one, we've talked about objects and heirlooms, and Instagram and Facebook, I have Allison Gilbert was taken. So you can look at A Gilbert Writer, W-R-I-T-E-R, A Gilbert Writer. And I would love to hear from you guys. And I know I mentioned that I would create, I think I said this, didn't I? Unless I'm about a password or a coupon code with the name Claire. And I'll definitely do that. So I'll have to think about how to pull that off, but I will. And I'll get a discount code to you guys on this call today.
Amazing. Thank you, Allison. Allison, can you take 1 second to answer this question? We do have to end, but Sylvie wants to know, apart from having photos on a table to honor a deceased sister's presence at her daughter's wedding, what else could she do besides photos?
What else can you do with photos?
To honor somebody who's gone at a wedding.
Oh, at a wedding. Okay, I'm sorry. I see what you're saying. Well, in a very brief period of time, I'll tell you what I did at my wedding in honor of my mom, who was no longer living. This could be inspiring, potentially. And if I'm not answering the question that you most want, please just email me. You could find my email on my website, but it's just to write it down. It's allison@allisongilbert.com, because I hate answering a question that maybe I didn't understand on a chat. But here's what I think you asked is, what else can you do besides having a photo at a wedding? My mom was a real businesswoman, back in the 70s and the 80s, and she wore scarves all the time, back when scarves were like very in style with those 80s business suits. And after my mom passed away and I was planning my wedding, we stitched 4 of her larger scarves together. So it created one big square. And that is the canopy that my husband and I got married under. And so it felt like we just felt like we were with her and she was with us, and we were kind of in her embrace. And so that was just one use of her scarves that we really put into our wedding that I just, I'm still grateful that we did that.
That's gorgeous. Thank you, Allison. Thank you to all of you guys and to Reimagine for this amazing season of holding space. We are going to be back in October with even more guests and more conversations, and I will let Dara tell you a little more. But thank you so much, Allison. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much. And I want to let you all know that we will be sending a follow-up email with the coupon code and all the links. So I've been trying to write things in the chat, but don't worry, you can catch them. And yes, thank you for just a beautiful conversation. I was taking a lot in. And I just wanted to mention too, that if any of you are interested in actually hosting an event yourself during the festival, we are a community-driven festival and really are open to anyone, either an individual or an organization, to participate. And on the 24th, and I'm putting this link in the chat, we are actually hosting an event called The Art of Creating Inclusive Spaces, because one of our core values is inclusion, and trying to make our events more accessible and equitable. And so what we're trying to do is train the people that are putting on events on how to do this. And we're working with an organization called Holistic Underground, who works on a lot of diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives. So I recommend attending that, and you will be hearing more information about upcoming events very soon. And make sure you should all be part of the mailing list if you're attending today. And lastly, I just wanted to take one quick moment to thank our sponsors, but of course, I don't know why it's not coming up. Okay, well, I'm just going to let that go, but we do thank all of our, sorry, I'm trying to share my screen, but it's not working, who have been supporting this work throughout the year. So with that, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your week and weekend, and we will look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye, Allison.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye. Bye.